Let me introduce myself. My name is Hector Menendez. I'm with the Department of Animal Science located in Rapid City. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Julie Walker, who's a professor and SDSU Extension Beef Specialist. Today, she'll be presenting about meeting the nutritional needs through various management strategies, fence line weaning, and grazing standing corn. And so we're very excited to have Julie here with us today. Throughout the presentation, feel free again to ask questions through the chat or Q&A comments. There will be the QR code for credit at the end of the presentation, and we will have a poll for your feedback. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Dr. Walker, to give your presentation. And yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, let me share my slides. As I jokingly say, I'm on my way out more than my way in. So please let me know that you can actually see my slides. Can you see the entire slide or not?
We can see it in presentation mode. So we're seeing the kind of with the notes.
Yep. That. So see, I knew that was going to happen. So I just needed to redo that. Now, can you see it in presentation mode?
It's yes, this is the correct form, Julie. Looks
okay,
good.
Perfect. Thank you. So as Hector has indicated, we are going to visit about weaning, and we're also going to visit about grazing standing corn. And I strongly encourage you, please ask questions as we go through. I personally don't need to listen to my voice. I would rather us have a conversation than me just spewing facts and maybe not directly answering your questions. So please, at any time that you have questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and they will let me know that so I can see them. So, so let's move forward. So I'm going to start with weaning, and maybe I'm going to start with weaning. So some of the weaning considerations. First, I always like to, one of the purposes of weaning, and particularly fence line weaning, is to really reduce the stress that we're going to have on those calves. And so some of those things that we need to do is dehorn or castrate prior to weaning, when they still are, ideally they would be younger than they are right now. But you certainly want to do that prior to weaning. The other one you want to consider is your vaccination program. And so what I'm going to tell you in that realm is to visit with your local veterinarian. He knows your program. He knows what's happening in your realm. And so what you want to do is ideally set these calves up for weaning. And so my next slide, I'm going to show you the requirements that I make. I run the calf value discovery program here at SDSU. And so these are the vaccinations that we want on board for those calves that come into our program. And so I worked with our state veterinarian, Dr. Russ Daly, to come up with this recommendation, but please visit with your local veterinarian. But you can see that there's the 5-way and then the 7-way. And so we want to really focus on getting those calves as healthy as possible. I don't care if you're early weaning them, traditionally weaning them, using a fence line weaning, or what we're going to call a 2-step process. You really want to have a good vaccination program on for those calves. So like I said, we're going to talk about 3 different types because I want to do some comparisons. So I want to look at total separation or abrupt separation. Then we want to look at fence line weaning, and then we want to look at 2-stage or 2-step weaning is what it's often referred to. So let's just talk about some pros and cons of abrupt weaning or substitute. So we're either going to move the calves to a new spot, or we're going to move the cows to a new spot. And so there's a variety of ways people will do this. They'll take the calves, they'll sell them the day that they wean them, And so they're selling bawling calves. And so an abrupt weaning system allows a producer to do that. You don't need another pen for those calves. You don't need another pasture for those calves. And so basically we think about taking those calves right off the cow. The other issue is we reduce the need for forage or the amount of forage or other feedstuffs that we would need to feed to these calves once they've been weaned, or while they're in the preconditioning or transitional period of a fence line weaning or two-step weaning process. And so we're going to talk about how much of that forage or potentially how much forage that we're talking about in that. Some of the cons are it is high stress. You will hear bawling calves for several days. And typically those calves are transported to a new, they get a new diet. They no longer have their mom for milk. They may have been separated, so the steers and heifers may be separated, so that may add more stress. So we know that this is probably the highest stress level within the weaning realm. So the next one we kind of went to is what we call a fence line weaning. And so I got a few years on me, but this is how we always weaned our calves. Our corral was right out kind of, and all the cows could come along the edge and put their nose up to their calf and such. And so even though it wasn't fence line weaning that we consider today, we were doing this in the 70s. With our calves, where we put them in a pen, but the moms could still get at the calves, still see the calves could see the moms. So typically today we think about doing this out on pasture. And so those calves are still consuming the same kind of diet they were while they were on mom. And so typically those cows and calves can have nose to nose contact through the fence, but they can't, the calves can't suckle. And so we need to make sure that we have good quality forage when we do this, because those calves have relatively high nutrient demands compared to the cows. So when we think about these things, what are the pros to this? There's a decrease in the stress level. Additionally, like I have said, those calves are staying on the same diet that they had previously been on. And so then they can adapt. And so typically when we think about fence line weaning, we're talking usually producers will leave those cows and calves next to each other like a week, maybe 2 weeks kind of scenario. So what are some of the cons? You got to have a good fence. You can't have a fence that looks like the wind might blow it over. You need to be able to have a fence that will keep the cows on one side, the calves on the other, and no nursing between. And so the construction of that fence can be a challenge. You can do that with a four barb or 5 barb fence or hot fence. There's been a wide variety of what producers have used to make this very successful. And the other thing is you need to really do good grazing management. And so because you want relatively good young forage for those calves to graze. And so a lot of producers are telling me this year with the drought, this is becoming more of a challenge because they just don't have the high quality feed that they will be able to have for forage for those calves. But you can supplement that even within a fence line situation. So that's what we're going to talk about when I talk about fence line weaning. So the third type is a 2-stage or 2-step process. So typically what you'll do is they will put a nose ring in the calves, and this will minimize the abilities of the calves to suckle, but they're right along mom. And so producers will do these for 5 to 2 weeks. Most of those recommendations now are 5 to 7 days where we do that. And then we virtually abruptly wean them, but they've already been removed from milk. But we're removing them physically from each other at that point in time. So this is why it's called a 2-step phase. So you have to get the calves in put the nose rings in. So you got to run them through the chute. And then at the end, again, you're going to have to remove those. And so it's 2 rounds through the chute. So you need to evaluate if that's something you want to do or not, or if you have the facilities to do it. So some of the pros of this is it's less stressful than the abrupt separation. But it also allows the calves to adjust to basically being removed from milk during this time. And they usually also are continuing to be in a very familiar environment, as well as they're on the same forage as they previously had been. So again, think about that calf's nutritional needs, and we need to up that nutritional. So we need some decent forage out there, some high quality forages for those calves to eat. So some of the cons of a 2-step or 2-stage is the cost or labor. You know, you got to run them through the chute twice. You have to buy the nose rings. Now, please note that the nose rings can be reused. We highly recommend that you sanitize them between calves or between uses. And typically those devices will run $2 to $5, kind of depends on which ones you want. The retention rate, they report from about 65 to about 100% retention. They're really not suitable for calves under 425 pounds. And so as you think about those, you need to think about what size your calves are for this 2-step. The other thing, when you're purchasing your nose rings, some of them are adjustable, so you can tighten them down. Others are just kind of like a snap in kind of thing. You put them in and they snap in and they're held in place. And so when we think about those things, you may decide will influence which ones you want to purchase. And so if anyone has any like stories that they've had good success with the particularly nose ring, I'd love to hear them. And I'm sure your co-attendees would also like to hear them. They do provide anecdotal things are very helpful when you learn some of these things. So now what I want to do is talk about some of the research that we've seen with these various types of weaning programs. So the first one I want to look at is these were with heifers, and they were looked at weaning time. And so I just kind of want to set up this graph. So this was average daily gain after weaning. So there is the first line, this bluish line, was dry lotted. So those were abrupt weaning. The heifers were removed from the cows, removed a good distance. The next line was the fence line weaning. And then we go to the gray bar, which is the dry for year 2, and then the fence line weaning for dry 2, and then for dry year 3. So you can see it's dry lot is the first for year 1, and then pasture, and as we go through this. So this is average daily gain up to 2 weeks, 4 weeks, into December, and then into April, because these are replacement heifers that they were hanging around, so they were around for a while. So let's just look at some of these differences. So in year 1, they saw a difference where those in the pasture, as anticipated, typically with fence line weaning calves, they will gain better in the first 2 weeks than those that were abruptly weaned. And this is exactly what we showed. So then let's go to year 2. They were silly enough where they repeated the data, and then they saw that the dry lotted calves outperformed the pasture. So you may be asking me, what happened here? And what happened here was they had poor quality forages. So those forages on the pastures were not up to the nutritional needs of those calves. And so as we think about that, we need to think about how we can deal with those scenarios. And then, so this was abruptly the first 2 weeks. So let's just look at 4 weeks for those first couple years. We can see in up to 4 weeks, the abrupt weaning and the fence line weaning had similar weights at that point. However, in year 2, those ones that were still in the pasture had not caught up to those that had abruptly weaned. And so as we think about those things, things can happen that we get an odd year out, and these things may not happen based on the forage quality or a particular disease load, or pink eye could go through, or various medical health issues could impact that. So as we looked in year 3, we saw no statistical differences up to 2 weeks, up to 4 weeks. However, when we got to December and to April, so we followed these for a substantial period of time, they did. Those pasture ones did not perform up to the level of the ones that were in the dry lot. Now remember, those that are in the dry lot were very easy to ensure that we're delivering all the feed ingredients that we need, or the nutrients those calves need. So I see there's a question, and I don't know if it's okay. So let's go to the next slide. And so we're going to look at another project. So this is the same one. So we're looking at weaning versus those April weights. And again, we have the same treatments. Dry lot is the first one for year 1. The next one is pasture, dry lot 2, pasture 2, dry lot 3, pasture 3. When we looked at weaning weight, we would expect no differences, right? We've done nothing to change the difference of those. However, we can tell in year 3 that there may have been some differences in forage quality because we didn't see the same weights. Or the other issue, we may have younger cows, so maybe we had less weight on those calves at weaning, but those would be represented throughout both treatments. However, when we got to April, we did see a difference with those pasture wean calves versus those that were put in a feedlot or a dry lot. And so as you think about those things, typically we see the differences in average daily gain or weight differences dissipate within 2 weeks, and almost ideally always within 4 weeks. So there are scenarios where this may happen, but again, when we look at these weights in April, we're looking at over 900-pound replacement heifers, and both of these groups were in adequate condition for breeding and such. So there wouldn't be a reproduction issue due to the fact of the slight differences we saw statistically in those. So we may found a statistical difference, but it might not be a biological difference that we would worry about on the farm or the ranch. So as we look at those other strategies, so this is a study that was done by Price and others in 2003, and they did 3. So they did wean calves, they fence lined wean calves, and then they did the total separation, but they left those calves on pasture. So we weren't changing the diet, we were just changing how they got weaned. So think about that. So they're still on the diet. So we're thinking about this. This is going to be stress induced, not diet induced. So as we looked at 2 weeks post weaning, we can see that those fence line weaning calves were keeping up with those that weren't even weaned. However, those that were totally separated and moved over to a different pasture compared to where from their moms, they did see a slight decrease in the amount of weight that they gained within that 2-week period. And as we go out to 10 weeks, you can see that there was actually a statistical difference between all of these treatments. And so as we think about that, that does have an impact. And so in a couple slides, we will look at what potential things may have been impacting these. And one of those are are stress hormones that those calves had on board or the presence of those. So Price also added a couple more studies. So we're just going to look at these. And these were not statistically different from those in the total separation. So I did not present those in the first study, or in the first slide. But you can see that when they precondition them, so they set those calves up to be preconditioned, so they recognize feed, those kind of things. They recognized what a bunk was, or those that were not preconditioned, they did not see a statistical difference between those groups. And so typically we would say with preconditioning, we would expect those calves to do better in those scenarios. But you have to remember that those calves were put out on pasture, not into a dry lot. And so those may have influenced the results that they saw in the study. So as we look at those, they put pedometers on the cattle. So basically it was a Fitbit for cows, just like the humans wear now. And so they looked at time eating, walking, laying down. So if they're laying down, they're assumed to be resting, those kind of things. And then vocalizations. And so this is how many seconds per hour for a group of 10 calves, because it would be virtually impossible to watch all of the calves within a group. So the big ones you want to notice here is that fence line weaning, those calves were eating similar to those that were non-weaned. And so if they're eating, they're consuming nutrients, they potentially gain better. And so those that had this total separation, we could see that they were eating slightly less than those that were not weaned or on the fence line. When we looked at walking, you can see that that total separation group was walking around more, probably walking, looking for mom, looking for the right feed, those kind of scenarios. And as we look at laying down, we can see that the laying down, the non-weaned and the fence line weaning was similar to that of each other. However, total separation was less than that. So basically they were not, typically we'd say they were not as comfortable. So therefore they weren't regurgitating, they weren't chewing their cud, those kind of scenarios. And so when we look at total vocalizations, or what we call bawling, so, or the calves bawling, those non-weaned calves, we would expect not to be bawling. They have nothing to be worried about. They're with mama. But when we looked at the fence line weaning versus the total pasture separation, we can see that those calves in the fence line weaning had about half of the vocalization that the total separation had. So as we think about those things, that does have an impact in how those calves will perform after they're been weaned. So another study that was done by Buskirk in 2007, he weaned at 173 days. And so let's just think about that. That may be where some producers are at this year. So that's why I wanted to bring this study up to the forefront. He abruptly weaned, he fence lined, and then at 5 days, he moved the cows. He left the calves in the same pasture. He used a two-step wean thing, and he moved the cows on day 5. So he removed those calves and cows. They were separated on day 5, just to give you an idea. So up to 14 days, those fence line weaning calves gained more. They only followed the calves to day 42, and there was no differences in weight by day 42 between any of those 3 studies. They did follow those calves to what they called their normal weaning time, which was 207 days. And at 207 days, think that's about, think about that's where that 42 days would be. There was no difference in that weight. And so as we think about those things, it's relatively short-lived. But what I want to do now is talk about some of the forage differences because we're really talking about this in a drought year. And so can we save forage? What can we do within that scenario? So there's more than just the calf side, there's the cow side. So a lot of producers this year are telling me that their cows are a little thinner than maybe they want them to be. And so they're wondering if by early weaning or pulling those calves earlier, they'll be able to help. And so the blue line is early weaning. So this is at early weaning time. This is what we call traditional weaning time, the TW. And then we have beginning of winter feeding and then end of winter feeding. And this is the body condition score of those cows. You can see at early weaning, there was no differences between those cows. However, at traditional weaning time, those that still have the calf on was about a half to 0.6%, or 0.6, or about a half body condition score less than those cows that had been weaned. And so if we have cows, think about this, that are thin, we can pull those calves and they potentially can maintain, or they're certainly not going to continue to go backwards in their body condition score. And so since after the traditional weaning, we had all of those cows had the opportunity. We dropped the nutritional needs of those cows because they're not lactating. And so then we can increase body condition score, which we saw the traditional wean ones were increasing, but these early weans were in good condition. We didn't need them to add any more condition. And by the end of the feeding period, or as we're getting ready for calving, we saw that those had caught up. So now let's pop over to my slide that talks about the amount of forage that weaning impacts. So when we think about this, we can think about the calves to reduce forage consumption. So I'm just going to say a 4-month-old calf will consume between 1.4 and 2% of its body weight. A lactating cow, we estimate, is at about 2.5% of body weight. And a dry cow will consume about 1.8 to 2% of her body weight in forage. So that calf is consuming 400 pounds times the 1.7. So it's going to eat about 7 pounds of dry matter per day. That lactating cow, when I calculate that, that's about 35. And that dry cow is about 27 pounds. So that's about an 8.4 pounds a day saving of forage. And so as we think about that, if we abruptly wean or we put those calves in the feedlot, we have alleviated that natural resource, that grass out there. So if I look at that, I can get about, for every 3 cows, I get another day of forage out there that those cows can graze. And so as we think about weaning or that early weaning scenario, this is how we can potentially, and this is why cows will improve their body condition score once we remove that calf, is because it doesn't have those. They will consume less, even though they have the opportunity to consume the same amount as they were through lactation. So there's the possibility here of increasing or saving some forage when we early wean, or most of them early wean I would think would be gone by now, but we early wean them even a month early will have an impact on forage production, particularly if you're shipping those calves or shipping them to someone that's backgrounding them for you, or those kind of scenarios. If that calf is still maintained on your operation, you still have this. It doesn't matter if it's going to be forage in the pasture or forage in a feedlot that I'm going to deliver. So you just need to provide that food stuff for that calf yet. So let's think of some considerations for those. So for fence line weanings, we need good fence, so there's no nursing, and that they'll keep the cows and calves apart. And so you just need to evaluate which maybe pasture has the best setup. you know, maybe your fence you don't feel is quite strong enough. Can you string a hot wire? And I would recommend stringing the hot wire on each side to keep the cows and calf off of the fence. The other thing is I typically recommend to producers to consider, if you're going to use fence line weaning, the pasture you're going to leave the calves in, have them in there for a minimum of a week prior to moving the cows to another pasture, because this will allow the calves to be familiar where they're getting water, where they've been grazing, those kind of scenarios. So that will increase their ability to forage and get what they need out of there. The third recommendation I have is that for yearlings or cows, if you can have a yearling or a cow that's dry and doesn't have a calf, to help lead those calves around to water and such, it works really well. It's like they're kind of lost if they don't have a leader. And so if you can provide a cow in there with leaders, that usually helps. So when we get to 4, some things to think about is, what is your forage quantity or quality will influence your average daily gain. You could see with the Pruitt's research, when forage quality was declined, it impacted how those calves on that pasture performed. And so you could use a hayfield that maybe has came back with some of the moisture we've gotten in recent days, you know, so something along that line. Or you could have planted, if you're thinking about in future doing something with an annual forage or something along those lines, that could potentially be used with that. So, and the other issue is maybe you're not worried about average daily gain as much as the stress on those calves. On the other issue with supplementation, you may need to supplement, because remember that those calves' nutrient requirements, particularly crude protein, is going to be probably 14%, maybe 16%, where a cow's is about 8%. So we're not worried about them typically in drought situations, but we may need to supplement a really palatable type protein such to help those calves utilize the energy in that forage. And the other issue is, does this fit into your system? You know, so does it work for you? And so I think it works really well with replacement heifers, because you're not really panicking about average daily gain, or if you're backgrounding the calves, you're probably not. But if you're going to sell those calves immediately once they're weaned, this may be something that might not fit into your plans, because you're going to want the maximum pounds to sell at that time. So that's kind of what I have on the weaning, and then I'm going to switch into the corn grazing. I see there's one question in chat. So, would you recommend weaning calves earlier than usual to make up for losses in forage intake caused by drought? And typically my answer would be yes, particularly if you're really short on forages. By weaning that calf, you will decrease about 7 pounds for a 400-pound calf. You may have heavier calves, those kind of scenarios. And so weaning early, or weaning even 2 to 3 weeks earlier, has a tremendous impact in how much forage you have out there for your cows. And then you may not have to sell as many of your cows in those scenarios. So any other questions for the weaning portion of it? And we can answer them at the end too. But if you're thinking about that, I'm going to move on to my grazing standing corn, but I will gladly answer any questions. Okay, so I have some pictures of some different standing corn. Some of these have been taken recently, some have been taken in previous drought years, but grazing, it totally depends on what you have there. And so what we first need to do is do an assessment of what you even have and what is available. Because this bottom picture in your bottom left, the nitrate concentrations of this I wouldn't risk my cows out on. However, when we get into this a little higher in the upper left, where that's probably 5 to 6 feet tall, we have a total different scenario in nutrients and worries about nitrates. So I just want to go through some examples within that. So what causes high nitrates? Typically we say it's drought. And so that's, we can have other issues. But I think about nitrates as the way it gets nitrogen up the plant. So anything that will disturb that pathway to taking that nitrogen to the grain will cause us to have nitrates along that. So typically we see them in the bottom portion, bottom third, I usually say, of the plant. But so we need to think about those. So I just quick want to throw this slide up. These are our potential nitrate problem children, or our crops that we think about: corn, sorghum, sudan grass, millets can be. Oats is a tremendous nitrate accumulator. Our rye, triticale, turnips can be high, as well as a lot of our weeds potentially will be high in nitrates also. So as we think about those, we may need to think about some of those. So let's get there. So here's our nitrate analysis. So these are what we consider below these levels, we have would be called safe. We wouldn't worry about grazing those or consuming those by cattle. And so what I'm going to use today are the nitrate nitrogen levels. And so that's about 2,300. I'm just rounding up because it will make it easier to talk. Above that, I need to start blending it, those kind of things. So that becomes difficult when we're grazing a corn stalk. So I have some scenarios, and these are from Nebraska, but I was able to have someone down there that had followed these, and these were from a few years ago, but the same concept applies. So they were dry land. So under irrigation, we have totally different scenarios, but they put 80 pounds of nitrogen on. And so producers need to think about how much nitrogen they put on there. And the harvest date here was August 24th, but this corn was about 6 feet tall. So as we think about that, that is scenario one. So let's look at this. So my red line up here tells me where it's potentially toxic. And so I looked, they broke apart the plants by area, as you can see here. So the leaves, the ears, the first 8 inches, the next 8 inches, next 16 inches, and so on. You can see within this scenario that all of the plant, the entire plant, would potentially be safe to consume. And so grazing this would not be an issue. And so we're going to talk about how we're going to do some of that and figure out our acreage and some of those things later. But in this scenario, that would not be an issue. And as we look at the crude protein content of that drought-stricken corn on a dry matter, typically our mature cows are going to be, these are non-lactating. So if they're lactating, they're up here in the 10s, but they're going to have relatively good crude protein. However, if they're non-lactating, they're probably in the 7 to 7.5. So I'm just going to go 7 here. Let's see if I can draw a line. Nope. Oops. I apologize. So the 7, you can see that most of the plant, they're going to be okay. A mixture of that plant, they're going to be okay. We might need to add a little protein for supplementation. So what are we going to look for here? I'm probably going to look for when there's no more corn in the manure to say, okay, I might need to start supplementing. So because of the protein content. So here's scenario 2. So this producer had the same ideas in the spring. He put on 80 pounds of nitrogen. However, this only got 4 feet tall. And so this is a total different scenario than when the corn gets to 6 feet tall. So our nitrate, our nitrate nitrogen, you can see right down here, our red line here. A lot of those, the bottom portion of that plant, or the bottom third of, I guess, bottom quarter of that plant is in excess of what we want in safe levels for nitrates. However, we can eat those leaves and ears and the top part of the plants. So as we think about those things, we have possibilities even with the shorter stuff, but we're going to have to manage it to make sure we don't have a lot of consumption of these lower portions of the plants. So crude protein here, if I look at my magic line of 7, all of those, I'm not really going to be panicking within that scenario. So as we think about those, it becomes critically important that we're probably not going to have to supplement our protein as much. So next, this is some research I did, and we fed cows. So this is the question I get from people or producers a lot is, oh, they're going to be eating too much corn out there. And so my cows are going to get foundered. They're not going to be able to perform. We're going to lose calves, blah, blah, blah. So when I started my master's, we were in drought situations, and I was in Indiana. So we brought the cows in and we fed them. So we did 2% hay, so about 25 pounds of dry matter. And then we fed about 12 pounds of hay and 5 pounds of corn, or about 8 pounds of corn and about 6 pounds. And then we also did corn silage. And then this was year 2. And you can see that basically we have a substantial amount of corn that these cows were eating. So as we look at those body condition scores and weight, we need those cows. This is the right 3 months before they calved. We need them gaining about 1 pound a day. And in year 1, everything worked perfect. Year 2, our corn, because our hay was a little lower quality, about 8%, we didn't see the same gain. But look at this 1% and 0.5%, we saw exactly what we needed for those cows. So think about that. That was when we think about how much forage and how much corn was included in those diets. That's what we're going to be feeding in a standing crop, but they're going to graze it instead of us delivering it to them. So I just wanted to point out that to you quickly, that this is doable and it is easily done. So let's just think about some of the precautions or what we need to do before we start doing this. We need to check what herbicides were used on that crop. Can we graze after that? I am not a chemical person. I'm not in agronomy. So we would have to, you have to look at those chemicals and see if there's any restrictions that can be grazed. And if there is, we don't graze the crop. The other thing is we need to test for nitrates. We need to know what we're managing, because we don't want to lose cows, calves, have abortions, those kind of things. The other thing we need to do is estimate the corn present in the field. So you just go down the field, chuck some ears into a 5-gallon bucket and get an idea, so you can calculate how much corn is there. So we can basically run a 4-wheeler through, run an electric fence, and manage how much we can have or how much we're going to have for those cattle at each time. So why do we care about grain? I'm a nutritionist. I had to throw this in, sorry guys. But the one is acidosis. So if they get too much grain, all of a sudden we can cause acidosis. So basically what we're doing is burning the inside of the rumen, and that's where we absorb about 90% of the energy out of a beef cow. And so we need to ensure that we're not doing any damage to that rumen. So we're interfering with volatile fatty acid absorption. We can cause a lameness, we can cause abortions. They typically don't happen if we manage correctly. And in extreme cases, people have lost cattle from consuming too much grain and typically this is in an abundance. So what we want to do is I want to go through some mediation types of how we can mediate these risks. So the first one is selecting the cattle that you want to use to graze. Calves and yearlings typically won't find the ears, or those cattle that are naive to grazing corn, they won't find the ears nearly as fast as a cow. A cow has radar for ears. I'm just going to be honest with you. And so you may want to consider using calves or yearlings to graze that, but typically what we're short on is forage for our cows, but we can do this with our cows too. The other really critical part is we need to adapt those cows to corn. And so we need to start with about 3 pounds and over about 10 days, get them up to about 7-8 pounds. So you need to spread it out. So about every 2 days, you add another pound kind of scenario, or every half pound every day. So you're adjusting or adapting the rumen to get the right bugs in there to use this corn. So that's critically important, that this step can't be stopped or skipped in this thing. You need to adapt them to the amount of corn that they will be consuming. So the other ones to mitigate this risk is to limit how much they have access to. So you can do this with hot wires, cross fencing. Typically what I think works really well, and if there's producers on here that have grazed before, you can take a 4-wheeler and drive down, knock down, so when they get to that barrier, they know that there's going to be a hot fence there. A lot of producers will start with a couple hot wires to start with, and as they go further and further into the cornfield, they'll probably go to 1, because the cattle will get to that 4-wheeler barrier thing, or where the corn's laid down, and all of a sudden they'll say, oh, the hot wire is going to be here, we're going to be zapped if we go any further. So ideally, if you can do a day's time, so you need to calculate how much forage is standing out there. So you can do that, help by height. You can also by how much corn is in there, and then we can mediate how much of this standing corn you will give them at a time. But let's just be practical. You might want to do 2 to 3 days at a time. Don't go to the point of, well, if I can do 2 to 3 days, I can go to a week. That gets extremely risky, because then they can go and eat a lot of corn and not have to intake enough fiber or eat the leaves in the stalk and those kind of things. And so typically what we say is to watch for kernels in the manure is the last one. And typically what we do is, if there's no kernels of corn in the manure, we would protein supplement them. But what I'm thinking I want you to use it slightly different in this scenario is, if there's no corn in the manure, then they're running out of ears, and they might be eating too far down on the plant. And so then you might be running a higher risk of getting into higher nitrates. And so instead of the flip side that we normally talk about with grazing harvested stocks, so we've already harvested the grain, and then there's corn out there, we use it to supplement. In this scenario, if there's not corn in that manure, we also may be starting them to graze too far down the stalk, and we will risk some things there. So Hector, I think that is what I have today. Here's my contact information, but I would love to take some minutes, some time, and answer some questions.
So Julie, thank you so much. That was an outstanding presentation and very relevant to the conditions that a lot of our producers are in. And so feel free again to use the chat to message everyone or Julie directly. Again, you can email her afterwards, or the Q&A session. While we're waiting for people to respond, we're going to go ahead and throw up a poll. And after that poll, we will get Connie to put up the code for credit. And so, yeah, let's get that poll up. Thank you so much. There it is. And Julie, while we're waiting and giving people an opportunity to fill the poll and ask questions, have there been a lot of cattle that have been affected by nitrates this season, or a lot of those reports coming in?
Heard of any reports, but producers are pretty cautious about that. The other thing producers need to think about is, and Connie can probably answer this better than I can, being she's an agronomist and I'm not. But typically what I'll see is, like, if we get a rain, then the nitrates start moving up the plant and there's a bigger issue, like if the cattle are out then. And then, so typically I'll say, like, if it's rained and you've taken a sample, you may want to give it a couple weeks or a week and then take another sample, just due to the fact that I've had some producers, they got a spot of rain and then they're like, well, I'm going to be able to feed this rye or whatever they're feeding, and it was extremely high in nitrates. And then a couple weeks later, they're like, well, I can't feed it because it's so high. They got their test results back. And I'm like, let's test it again. I said, you took that right after the rain. And so then they were able to see that. And so I just think that's kind of critically important as they think about that. I do have a lot of producers that say, my neighbor has some corn that I could graze, but there's no fences. And they kind of worry about fence laws in South Dakota, because if you look at the fence laws, it's 4 barbs. And so I never realized that until I was telling some people once. And so as we think about that, they need to think about some of those things as they're reaching out to producers if they have some crops that have failed or there's not a lot of corn there to graze. And so, and Jack can probably answer the question of what's that value of that feed economically, or what do you charge your neighbor for grazing your corn? And the other thing we didn't talk about is talking to your insurance guy to see if you can even graze it, because what's the consequences? Is that available there or not?
Sure, Julie, those are all really great considerations. And so I'm just going to read from Valerie. She says, I have a friend in Montana that used Quit Wean nose flaps for 5+ years and had a 90% success rate.
Yeah. And so they're getting so much better than when I started. When we started using those in 2003, it was a prayer. I swear we could take duct tape around the nose, but they're getting better.
Sure. And then Jack commented, I'll let everybody just read that one, or actually, I'm just going to read it. We have a field that has about 10% at a 4-foot level. And the rest was harvested at an estimated yield of less than 90. Thoughts on 4-foot corn?
So 4-foot corn, I would get it tested to see where the nitrate levels are on it first, just so I know where. I'm going to be really honest, 4-foot corn makes me really nervous. I do a lot of flash grazing in that, where I would just go out and let them get the ears, the top, move them rapid and just move it through them. You're not going to have a good harvest efficiency on it, but the risks are much lower. Sorry, Jack, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's at the end of a field. So, and I'd estimated about probably 10% of that field, and the rest will probably just, is not harvested yet, but we will combine it. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the little stuff.
If you went back to my 4-foot, so it's 48 inches, a lot of that was hot, but the leaves and the ears weren't. And so if you can kind of do a flash grazing, and I'd be watching them there really carefully, I probably would use it with yearlings or calves, because they're not going to have a risk of abortions with too high of nitrates. And so I would probably go that route. And they are typically a little slower to find the ears then. And I might actually let those cattle have the other part that was harvested, because I'm guessing this is a thumb rule. Typically, if it goes to grain, nitrates are not nearly as big of an issue. That's a thumb rule. That does not mean follow that thumb rule, but it does tell me that if you got a decent harvest on that other, there may not be, I might test some of those stocks, but let them back graze on it. And I might even put the water so they have to back graze to the water, because then that will keep their stomachs fuller with some of the extra better stuff.
Yeah, you're raising a lot of issues for us. Because the water's right off of where the short stuff is. Yep.
Okay, I was just throwing out some ideas for you.
Yeah, thank you. I know it'll give more work for them, but that's all right. You don't want to risk those cows either.
No.
I was just going to comment on before they might turn in, if they weren't going to harvest, they'd want to have an appraisal done on the crop insurance side before grazing. It'd just be like cutting. Either got to leave some strips or get their appraisal done if they're carrying a crop insurance before grazing.
Because I've been driving, so I've been driving around South Dakota. I went to Pierre last Friday and I noticed there were some fields, like 6-8 strips left there, and I just assumed those were for crop adjustments.
Yeah.
I figured it was just for the corn, the pheasants to feed on, actually.
Well, and some might do it, leave it, end up leaving it, or come back and cut it. But some may leave it for snow catch too, and a little pheasant hunting.
Yeah. So I was just, we gotta feed the wildlife too.
Yeah, Jack, leaving us those strips so we can come pheasant hunting. It's really important. Well, as we're kind of rounding out the hour here, I wanted to circle back. So Connie's going to put up the QR code to get credit if you need that. But then also, Julie brought up a really good point. Connie, any comments about the pesticides or restrictions that producers should be aware of that might cause nitrates to accumulate due to stunted plant growth, and then also feeding restrictions?
Well, the biggest thing on the pesticide aspect is to see what was applied there and make sure that you're within that pre-harvest interval, like that was followed properly. What I have had some questions on from folks is they applied an insecticide in an alfalfa field or in a field, but forgot that they did that for when the crop was ready. They took the crop, so they harvested it. And then they will say remembered after the fact that, well, wait a minute, I applied the insecticide, and started to look at dates and found out that, they harvested a week early or 7 days early. Well, that gets to an issue where you need to get that tested before you'd feed it for pesticide residues, just because then it hasn't had enough time to work and break down and be at that safe level. And so we want to just really verify that you check those labels to make sure that they are, like I said, safe within that pre-harvest interval time frame. But the pesticides itself doesn't affect the nitrate accumulation. The nitrate accumulation is more of like the uptake within the nitrogen and the translocation and all of that within the plant within the moisture and the heat and that ability to process. So there's kind of two different aspects going on there. With the rain, it gets things going again, so things can start to move within the plant. But again, testing is the best line of defense there. You want to err on safety versus assuming that things are okay. And then for those that need that CCA credit, if you could pull out your mobile device, if you haven't already done so, open up the app and scan this QR code. This will be the only time that this QR code is shown for today's presentation.
Great, and thanks for those responses and great dialogue there, Julie and Jack and Connie. As we round out this episode of Drought Hour, or this webinar, stay tuned for the September series as we just kind of round out the harvest season and go into the fall. And so we'd like to thank everyone for attending. And if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and end this Drought Hour. So thank you so much.
Thank you.